I stopped running the moment I saw you." The words fell from Louis Hale's lips like a confession ripped from somewhere deep and irreparable, and Julia Alden felt the firelight blur in front of her eyes as the tears she had been holding back for 3 days finally threatened to betray her. She did not move. She could not. Every rational thought she possessed told her that this man was dangerous, that the darkness clinging to his coat like trail dust was not merely the residue of long roads and hard weather, but the stain of secrets she did not yet understand. The warrant in her saddlebag bore his name. She had read it so many times the words had become a kind of haunting. Louis Hale. Wanted for the murder of Marshall Dale Croft. Reward of $500. The paper had come into her possession 3 nights ago under circumstances that still made her stomach turn, and now here he was, sitting on the opposite side of her campfire in the New Mexico territory, his dark eyes catching the flame, his voice so quiet and honest that she almost hated him for it. Almost. Because the truth she was fighting hardest to suppress was this: she believed him. Not about the murder, not yet, but about the stopping, about the running. She had watched him for days before he knew she was watching, and even then she had seen a man who moved like someone who had long ago stopped expecting anything good from the world. And then something had shifted in him. She had seen it happen in real time. A man mid-motion, mid-flight, who had simply gone still. She pressed her hands against her knees and looked at him across the fire. "You are going to have to explain what that means," she said, "because right now it means nothing to me except trouble." He nodded slowly. He did not look away from her. That, too, unsettled her. Most men who carried secrets could not hold a steady gaze. Louis Hale looked at her like a man who had decided that whatever the cost of honesty, he was willing to pay it. "It means exactly what it sounds like," he said. "And if you want the rest of the story, I will give it to you, all of it, even the parts that might make you reach for that rifle of yours." She said nothing. She waited, and so he told her. 12 days earlier, Julia Alden had ridden out of the small settlement of Cora Bend, New Mexico territory, in the year 1882, with a leather saddlebag, a single-shot Springfield rifle, 2 changes of clothing, enough dried beef and hard biscuit for a week's travel, and approximately none of the clarity she had hoped moving west would provide. She was 27 years old, which in the language of the frontier meant she was neither young nor old, but suspended in that sharp middle ground where the decisions she made now would determine the shape of everything that came after. She had come west from Missouri 2 years prior, following the trail of a man she had once loved and later despised, and the settlement of Cora Bend had been her landing place when the horse went lame, and the money ran low, and the trail went cold. She had built something there, small but genuine. A room above the general store that she helped run in exchange for board, a garden that produced more than she could eat, a reputation for fairness and good sense that carried its own quiet currency in a place where trust was hard to establish and easy to lose. But then Thomas Becket had arrived, and with him, the slow unraveling of everything she had carefully assembled. Thomas Becket was a land speculator with clean boots and cruel eyes, and he had come to Cora Bend with a document that bore the territorial governor's seal and claimed ownership of the very building where Julia lived and worked. The general store's owner, a widower named Frank Aldis, had borrowed money from Beckett's company 2 years prior under terms that, when read carefully, constituted something not far from legal extortion. Frank had not read carefully. He had been desperate, and desperation rarely reads the fine print. Julia had read the document 3 times. She had seen the clause buried in the middle of the second page that allowed Beckett's company to claim the property not merely on default of payment, but on any disruption of lawful commerce, a phrase so deliberately vague it could mean anything, and had apparently been designed to mean exactly that. Frank Aldis owed money he could not pay. By the time Julia understood the true shape of the trap, Becket had already filed the claim at the nearest territorial court, which was 40 miles east in the town of Mercer. She had ridden to Mercer to contest the filing in person. She had documents of her own, 2 years of account records she had kept with meticulous care, proof that the store had operated at a consistent profit, proof that Frank's debt had in fact been serviced regularly until Beckett's company changed the payment terms without notice. She had witnesses willing to testify. She had, she believed, a case worth making. What she had not expected was that the judge in Mercer, a man named Hollis Pryor, was the cousin of Thomas Beckett's business partner. She had not expected the recess called on the first morning to stretch into an indefinite delay. She had not expected that when she returned to the boarding house where she was staying, someone had gone through her saddlebag and left behind a piece of paper that had not been there before. The wanted notice. Louis Hale, wanted for the murder of Marshall Dale Croft in Dona County. $500 reward. The paper was weeks old, worn at the folds, and it had been placed deliberately where she would find it. At first she had not understood why. Then, slowly, the logic had assembled itself in her mind like something dark and patient rising to the surface. Someone wanted her distracted. Someone wanted her afraid. Someone wanted her chasing a ghost story, while the real theft happened quietly in a courtroom with a compromised judge. She had made a decision then that she later recognized as both brave and possibly foolish. She would ride back to Cora Bend by a longer southern route that passed through the open country near the Jornada del Muerto, a stretch of high desert that was not technically a safer path, but was significantly less likely to contain anyone employed by Thomas Beckett. She would gather what she needed. She would find a way to file her case somewhere that was not Mercer. She had been 3 days into that ride when she first saw the man. She had noticed him before he noticed her, which was itself unusual. He rode a grulla horse, gray-blue as a winter morning, and he moved through the scrubland with the practiced economy of someone who had spent years making himself inconspicuous without fully achieving it. There was something about the line of his shoulders that refused invisibility. He was not a large man in the way of obvious physical dominance, but he was solid and capable-looking in the way of someone who had learned what his body could do under pressure and no longer needed to demonstrate it unnecessarily. She had watched him from a ridge, keeping her own horse still and silent, for nearly 10 minutes before deciding he was not following her. He was simply moving through the same empty country, traveling roughly southwest on what appeared to be no particular road toward no particular destination. She had kept her distance. She was not naive. On the second day, she had made camp in a shallow ravine where a seep of groundwater allowed her to refill her canteen. She was building her fire when she heard his horse before she saw him, and she had the Springfield in her hands and pointed before he cleared the ridge line. He had raised both hands without being asked. "I mean you no harm," he had said. "I saw your smoke. Most people who see my smoke ride around it," she had replied. "I thought about that," he had said honestly. "But I have not had water since this morning, and your camp is on the only seep I know of in the next 20 miles. If you want me gone after I fill my canteen, I will go." She had looked at him for a long moment. He had kept his hands raised the entire time, which showed either remarkable patience or genuine deference, and she was experienced enough at reading people to recognize the difference. She had lowered the rifle 6 inches, not all the way, just enough to signal that she was thinking about it. "Canteen only," she had said. "And you keep your hands where I can see them." He had dismounted slowly. He had filled his canteen at the seep. He had walked back to his horse without once reaching for the sidearm at his hip or the rifle in his saddle scabbard. He had been about to mount when he glanced back at her and said, "You are 2 days from anything in any direction. Are you sure you want to camp alone out here?" "I have been camping alone for 12 days, she had said. "That is not what I asked." She had not answered. After a moment, he had shrugged one shoulder and mounted and ridden away to the south. She had watched him go until he disappeared in the dusk, and then she had sat with her fire and her dried beef, and the strange sensation of a conversation that had left her more unsettled than the solitude preceding it. She had told herself it was the wanted notice still rattling around in her memory. She had told herself the unease was about the man's proximity to the name on that paper, nothing more. She had known even as she told herself this that she was not being entirely honest. The third day, everything changed. She had risen before dawn, as was her habit, and she had broken camp quickly and efficiently. She had ridden for 3 hours through the early morning cool before she heard the shots. They came from the south, not close enough to be immediate danger but close enough to be relevant, and she had pulled up on the ridge and looked down into the flat ground below. There were 3 men. They were riding hard in the direction of a fourth figure who was moving fast across the open terrain on a gray-blue horse. The Grulla. She recognized it before she recognized him. One of the 3 riders was gaining ground. As she watched, he drew alongside and made a grab for the other horse's bridle. The gray horse spun and the grab missed, and for a moment the 4 of them wheeled in a loose and violent circle below her. She could see even from the ridge that 2 of the 3 pursuers were carrying rifles at the ready. She made a decision that she would spend the next several days questioning. She raised the Springfield, steadied it, and fired a single shot into the dirt between the pursuing riders. Not at them, not to wound or kill. Just a clear and unmistakable signal that the geometry of this situation had just acquired a new variable they had not planned for. The 3 men pulled up hard. They looked up at the ridge. She was silhouetted against the early sky, and she knew she was visible. She knew this was a significant risk. She had taken it anyway, for reasons she could not fully articulate even to herself. The 3 riders conferred briefly. Then they turned and rode east at speed. Whatever Louis Hale was worth to them, a rifle on a ridge had apparently recalculated the cost. He had sat on his horse in the middle of the flat ground and looked up at her for a long moment. Then he had raised one hand, not in greeting exactly, but in acknowledgement, something more solemn than a wave. She had ridden down from the ridge. She had told herself it was to assess the situation, to confirm that the 3 men were genuinely gone and not circling back. She had told herself she was not doing this because she wanted to speak to him again. When she reached him, his face was composed, but his breathing was still elevated from the chase. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that was bleeding in a thin line down toward his cheekbone. His eyes were the color of dark river water, and when he looked at her, the expression in them was something she did not have a clean word for. Not gratitude exactly. More like recognition, as if she were a possibility he had not considered and was now being asked to account for. "You did not have to do that," he had said. "No," she had agreed. "Who are they?" A pause, not a deceptive pause, not the kind where a person rearranges the truth before presenting it, but the kind where a person is deciding how much truth they can afford. "Bounty hunters," he had said, "or close enough to it." "Close enough to it," she had repeated. "The distinction matters somewhat. It always does." She had watched him, he had watched her back. The cut above his eye was still bleeding, and she had, without fully deciding to, pulled a cloth from her saddlebag and held it out to him. He had taken it with a careful gesture, as though the small kindness was the most fragile thing he had handled in a long time. "I will not slow you down," he had said. "I know you do not want the company." "I never said that." It had come out before she could revise it. He had looked at her with something that moved too quickly through his expression for her to name it, and then he had nodded once and pressed the cloth to his brow. They had ridden together in silence for most of that afternoon. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It had the texture of 2 careful people making a preliminary assessment, gathering information through proximity and posture, and the small signals that language was too blunt to carry. She had noticed the way he read the landscape as they moved through it, the way his eyes tracked the high ground without appearing to, the way he never rode with his back to an approach. These were not the habits of a murderer. They were the habits of someone who had been hunted long enough to internalize the shape of pursuit. They had made camp together that evening without formally deciding to, in the way that practical necessities sometimes resolve questions that sentiment makes complicated. The desert was cold after dark. 2 fires were not more useful than one. These were facts, and they behaved accordingly. Over the fire she had studied him in the honest light and tried to reconcile what she saw with what the wanted notice had told her. He was perhaps 30 or 32, she guessed. The years in his face were not the years of dissolution or violence, but the years of exposure, of weather and distance, of a life lived almost entirely outdoors. His hands were scarred in the particular way of ranch work and hard travel, not the particular way of brawling. He had a quality of stillness about him that was not coldness but something closer to control, the stillness of a person who had learned to hold very strong feelings at a careful internal distance. "What is your name?" she had asked, though she already knew. He had paused. "Louis Hale," he had said. She had kept her expression even. "Julia Alden." "Where are you headed, Julia Alden?" "Cora Bend, eventually, by a route that avoids certain people." "That makes two of us." She had not asked about the warrant then. She had not been ready to hear the answer. She had made herself wait, and the waiting had given her time to watch more closely, and the watching had made the question more complicated than it had initially seemed. Now on the fourth night, 3 days after he had told her his name across a different fire, he had said those words. "I stopped running the moment I saw you." And the warrant was in her saddlebag, and the fire was between them, and she was listening. "Tell me about Marshall Croft," she said. He let the name settle in the air between them. He did not look surprised that she knew it. His eyes moved to the fire and then back to her. "How do you know that name?" he asked. "Someone left a wanted notice with your name on it in my belongings while I was in Mercer." He went very still, the kind of still that is different from his ordinary stillness, sharper and more alert. "In Mercer," he said slowly. "At whose direction?" "I believe Thomas Beckett's, a land speculator who is attempting to steal property from a man I work for." Something shifted in Louis's expression. Not surprise exactly, but the rearrangement that comes from unexpected information that changes the shape of a picture you thought you already understood. "Beckett," he said. "You know him." "I know of him." He exhaled through his nose and looked at the fire for a long moment. "Dale Croft was not a marshal when I knew him. He became one afterward. He became one in Doña County specifically, I think, because someone needed a badge in that county who would not ask the wrong questions. Someone like Beckett's people, or Beckett himself. I do not know the full shape of it. I only know my part of it." He turned back to her. "What I can tell you is that I did not kill Dale Croft. I have not killed anyone. I have spent 8 months running from a charge that was built out of whole cloth and aimed at me for one reason, because I witnessed something that someone powerful needed not to have been witnessed." She held his gaze. "What did you witness?" "A meeting," he said. 6 months before Croft was found dead, I was working on a horse ranch south of Las Cruces. Good work, honest work. The ranch ran land along the river, and part of my job was riding the boundaries early mornings. One morning I came up over a bluff and there was a group of men below me in a draw, men who had no business being on that land. There were 6 of them. I recognized 2. One was Dale Croft, who at that time was working as a sort of unofficial agent for a group of land investors, the kind of work that requires no announced title. The other was a man named Samuel Pryor. She felt the name land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. "Judge Hollis Pryor's brother." Louis's head came up sharply. "Hollis Pryor is the judge hearing your case in Mercer." "He is." "Then you are more tangled up in this than you know," he said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "Samuel Pryor and Dale Croft and Thomas Beckett are not 3 separate men doing 3 separate kinds of business. They are one operation. They acquire land. They use legal mechanisms, corrupt ones, to transfer property titles. They use marshals and judges they own to protect the transfers once made. And they use men like whoever built that warrant against me to eliminate anyone who might testify against them." Julia sat with this for a moment. The fire crackled between them. An owl called somewhere in the darkness to the east, and the sound was lonely and oddly precise, like a question being asked of no one in particular. "Then Dale Croft was not killed by you," she said. "He was killed by them." "My belief is that Croft became a liability. He knew too much about the operation's methods, and his death served 2 purposes. It removed a potential weak point, and it gave them a body they could pin on someone who had seen the meeting in the draw." someone who had no powerful friends and no obvious way to prove a negative. You, me, she looked at the fire. She looked at his face in the light of it. She thought about the wanted notice, about its careful placement in her bag, about the judge in Mercer and his convenient recesses, and his relationship to a man who had apparently witnessed a crime being planned. She thought about Thomas Becket with his clean boots and his legal documents and his patient, methodical way of taking things from people who could not fight back. "They left that notice for me," she said slowly, "because they knew you were in this area of the territory. And they wanted you to either turn me in or be frightened off. Either result served them. If you turned me in, they removed a witness before he could testify. If you ran, you abandoned your case in Mercer. But I did neither." "No," he said, and there was something in how he said it that was not quite admiration but lived in that neighborhood. "You did not." She picked up a stick and turned it in the fire, watching the end glow. "You said you stopped running when you saw me. That was before you knew any of this about Becket and me. What did you mean by it?" The silence that followed was not evasion. It was the silence of a man choosing his words with the care they deserved. "I have been running for 8 months, he said. "I have ridden through 4 territories. I have not slept 2 consecutive nights in the same place since last October. I have been careful and I have been quiet and I have been entirely alone, and there were days when the aloneness was not the hardest part. The hardest part was the absence of any reason to stop. Running is easy when you have no direction. It becomes exhausting when you cannot even imagine what stopping would look like." He paused. "Then I saw you on that ridge, with your rifle and your fire and your complete refusal to be afraid of something that had every right to frighten you, and something inside me went quiet. The kind of quiet that has been a long time coming." He met her eyes. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean, Julia. I stopped running the moment I saw you, and I cannot entirely explain it, but I am done pretending it is not true." She held his gaze for a long time. The fire between them felt less like a barrier and more like a shared warmth, something they were both leaning toward from their separate sides. "That is either the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," she finally said, "or it is the most effective approach I have ever encountered." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. "Which do you think it is?" She looked at him. She thought about the 3 days of watching him. She thought about the way he had accepted the cloth for his wound, as though small kindness was a language he had almost forgotten. She thought about the stillness in him, and the weight behind his eyes, and the way he had asked if she was sure she wanted to camp alone, not as a threat or a challenge, but as genuine concern with nowhere else to direct itself. "I think," she said carefully, "that you should get some sleep and we should talk about this more when we are not both exhausted and in the middle of an empty desert." He accepted this. He spread his bedroll on the other side of the fire at a respectful distance. She watched the fire burn lower and listened to the desert and thought about everything that had just been reorganized in her understanding of her own situation. Morning came gray and cool, with a wind off the mountains that smelled of pine from elevations they could not see. She woke before he did and sat with her back against her saddle and watched the sky lighten from black to purple to the deep clean blue of a New Mexico dawn, and she thought about what it would mean to trust this man. Not the soft trust of attraction, which she felt and had been honest enough with herself to admit, but the hard trust of shared stakes and aligned interests, and the kind of mutual vulnerability that 2 people in genuine danger require of each other. When he woke, he sat up with the easy economy of someone accustomed to sleeping rough, and immediately began checking his surroundings in the quiet, systematic way she had already come to recognize as his. Then he looked at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. And in that moment there was an acknowledgement between them of something that had no clean name yet, but had taken up residence in the air between them and would not be dislodged. "I want to help you," he said, "with your case, with Becket. You are a wanted man. Your testimony would be inadmissible in any court connected to this operation, and the operation appears to own a significant portion of the courts in question." "Not all of them," he said. There is a federal land office in Santa Fe with jurisdiction over territorial disputes of a certain scale, and there is a circuit court judge named Emmett Voss who rides out of Albuquerque, whose reputation I know to be clean. She looked at him. How do you know Judge Voss's reputation? Because I spent 2 of the last 8 months trying to figure out who in the territory I could actually trust. I made a list. It is not a long list, but Emmett Voss is on it. She felt something in her chest shift, a careful, reluctant opening like a door that had been kept locked for a long time and was now very slowly being tried. You have been building a case. I have been surviving, he said. But yes, also building a case. I have documentation, dates, locations, names, the meeting I witnessed in the draw, correspondence I managed to acquire that ties Pryor and Croft to Beckett's land company. I have been carrying it with me because I had nowhere safe to leave it, and no one I could hand it to without getting either myself or them killed. Louis, she said, and his name in her mouth felt like a kind of decision, deliberate and irrevocable. You are telling me that the evidence needed to clear your name is also the evidence needed to save Frank Aldis's store and expose Thomas Beckett. Yes, he said, and you have been carrying this evidence alone for 8 months. Yes. She looked at him for a long time. The morning light was fully arrived now, pale gold across the desert floor, and in it she could see the details of him with new clarity. The tension held in the set of his jaw, the way his hands rested on his knees with a deliberate looseness that was really the controlled readiness of someone who had been alert for too long. He was not a man at rest. He was a man who had forgotten what rest felt like, but was sitting very still in the approximate location where rest might be possible. Then we are going to Santa Fe, she said. Something moved across his face. Something that was neither relief nor gratitude nor hope, but perhaps all three together, arriving too quickly to separate into their component parts. Julia, he said, and there was her name in his mouth now, and it carried a weight she felt throughout her entire body. Do not, she said quietly. Not yet. Let us survive this first, and then we can figure out what the other thing is. He understood her immediately. She could see it in the way the intensity in his eyes pulled back a precise and measured distance. He was a man who knew how to wait. He had demonstrated it repeatedly. He would wait. They broke camp together, moving efficiently and with the beginning of a shared rhythm, and when she handed him the coffee she had made and their hands came close together in the exchange, she did not pull back quickly. Neither did he. It was a very small thing, and it was not small at all. The road to Santa Fe from the Jornada del Muerto was not a straight line. The territory's geography insisted on diagonals and detours, on arroyos that had to be forded, and ridges that had to be skirted, and small settlements that had to be assessed from a distance before being entered. They traveled largely in silence, the comfortable kind, occasionally punctuated by the practical exchange of two people navigating shared terrain, and occasionally by something less practical, a comment on the landscape, a memory offered tentatively and received carefully, the gradual accumulation of the small specific knowledge that constitutes the beginning of genuine intimacy. She learned that he had grown up in eastern Kansas, that his father had run cattle, and his mother had run the household and the school both, being the only woman in the county who had completed a formal education. She learned that he had come west at 19 looking for the kind of open space that Kansas with its constant population pressure no longer offered. She learned that he had spent years working horses, which was the work he loved best, work that required patience and attentiveness, and the willingness to understand something from the inside out rather than imposing a template from the outside. He learned that she had been a schoolteacher in Missouri before the man she had loved, a merchant's son named Gerald Marsh, had revealed himself to be something comprehensively different from what she had believed him to be. She did not detail this beyond what was necessary, and he did not press. He received the information with the same careful respect with which he seemed to receive all things that required care, and she felt the knot behind her sternum that had been there since Missouri loosened very slightly in response. On the second day of their joint travel, they stopped at a small settlement called Alcalde to buy grain for the horses and resupply their food. It was a quiet place of perhaps 40 souls, clustered around an acequia that fed from a nearby tributary, fields of late corn rustling in the afternoon wind. Julia went into the general store while Louis waited with the horses, this being the rational division of labor given that his face might be known to someone whose loyalty was uncertain. Inside the store, she bought what they needed from a woman behind the counter who had the calm competence of someone who had built her life out of practical skill and good judgment, and was satisfied with the result. As Julia counted out her coin, the woman behind the counter looked at her with a frank assessment. "You traveling alone?" the woman asked. "With a companion," Julia said. The woman nodded without visible judgment. "Road North has been active lately. Couple of riders came through yesterday asking about a man traveling alone," gave a description. Julia kept her expression neutral. "What kind of riders?" "The kind that carry more weapons than ranch work requires," the woman said dryly. She slid Julia's change across the counter. "The road northwest along the river is slower, but you see less of that kind of traffic." Julia held the woman's gaze. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with a completeness the word alone could not express. She went back to Louis and told him what the woman had said. He received it with the flat calm of someone for whom bad news in this general category was simply more data to be incorporated into planning. "The river road it is," he said. They rode the river road. It was indeed slower, threading through a country of cottonwood and willow along the Rio Grande, the mountains rising on both sides in the specific way of the Sangre de Cristo and the Jemez, that quality of ancient permanence that made human difficulty feel briefly less absolute. The light changed as they moved north, taking on the particular quality of the high country, clear and sharp, and somehow more honest than the flatland light below. On the third day of their joint travel, they made camp near the river, and after their fire was built and the horses tended, she asked him to show her the evidence he had been carrying. He opened his saddlebag and produced a wrapped oilskin bundle, the kind used to protect documents from weather, which told her something about how long he had been planning this, that he had thought to acquire the oilskin. He unwrapped it at the fire, spreading the papers carefully, and she read them with the same systematic thoroughness she had brought to Frank Aldis's financial records. What she found was thorough and damning. There were 4 letters, 3 in a handwriting she did not know and 1 that bore Samuel Pryor's signature, discussing the acquisition of properties through what they referred to in careful language as legal acceleration, a phrase that, read in context, meant the deliberate manipulation of loan terms to trigger defaults. There was a ledger page, clearly copied in Louis's handwriting from an original, showing payments from Beckett's Land Company to an account that corresponded to a name that would require further research, but was distinctly not a legitimate business expense. And there was a written account in Louis's own clear, careful hand, dated and detailed, of what he had witnessed in the draw south of Las Cruces, the 6 men, their names as he knew them, the exchange he had partially heard. "This is enough," she said. "This is genuinely enough if it reaches the right judge." "It is enough to start," he said. "It is not enough to end. What more do we need?" He looked at the papers for a moment. "A witness who is not me. My account alone can be dismissed as self-serving. But if we can find someone else connected to this operation who is willing to speak, someone with standing, someone whose credibility cannot be easily attacked." She thought about this. She thought about what she knew, about the people in Cora Bend, about the people in Mercer, about the shape of the operation as she now understood it. She thought about Frank Aldis, who was not a sophisticated man but was an honest one, and about the other property owners in the area who had lost land to Beckett's company, some of whom surely had documentation of their own. "Cora Bend first," she said, "and then Santa Fe." He looked at her across the papers. The fire was reflecting in his eyes, and the river was a sound behind them in the dark, and the mountains were a presence felt more than seen. "You trust me," he said, not a question. "I trust your evidence," she said carefully. "I trust your account of the drawing. I trust the character of a man who has spent 8 months running but never running toward harm." She paused. "The rest is still being assembled." "That is more than I have had from anyone in 8 months," he said quietly. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the space between them and very deliberately covered his hand with hers for a moment. Just a moment. Then she withdrew and looked back at the papers. "Get some sleep," she said. "We have a long ride tomorrow." She heard the quality of his silence change. It became something warm and full of things unsaid. And she sat with that quality for a long time after he had gone to sleep, listening to the river and the fire and the night, and acknowledging to herself, fully and without further evasion, that she was falling in love with this man, that she had been falling for days, that the feeling had the specific texture of a thing that had found its own level and would not be redirected by common sense or caution. She was also aware that the situation they were navigating was genuinely dangerous. The people behind this operation had killed at least once, had built legal machinery to protect themselves, and had demonstrated a willingness to reach into a stranger's saddlebag to plant evidence. They were not abstract obstacles. They were capable of real harm. She was also aware that this awareness did not change what she felt. It only made it sharper. They reached Cora Bend on the 4th day of their joint travel. The settlement looked exactly as she had left it, which was either reassuring or eerie. She could not decide which. The general store sat at the center of the main street, its sign faded by sun and wind, its porch occupied by Frank Aldis in his usual chair, looking like a man trying very hard to maintain a posture of normality over something that was threatening to collapse. When he saw her, he stood so quickly the chair scraped back. "Julia," he said. "Julia, Beckett's men came through 2 days ago. They said the court had ruled." Her stomach dropped. "Already?" "They served papers. They said I have 2 weeks to vacate." She was off her horse before he finished speaking. "Frank, did you sign anything?" "I did not. I told them I would not sign anything without my lawyer present, which they thought was funny because I do not have a lawyer and they knew it." "Good. Then the 2 weeks is real. We have 2 weeks." She turned to Louis, who had stopped at the edge of the street and was watching with the careful attention he brought to everything. "Frank," she said, "this is Louis Hale. He is with me and you can trust him." Frank Aldis looked at Louis with the honest appraisal of a man who had spent his life in small frontier communities where the assessment of character was a survival skill. "Is he the reason those hard-looking men came through here 4 days ago asking questions?" "He may be peripherally connected to that circumstance," Julia said. "They are the same men who want my store." Frank's brows went up. "Then they came down." "Well then," he said, with the resignation of a man whose situation has just gotten more complicated but who has decided to accept the complexity, "you both had better come inside." In the store, over coffee that was weak but hot, Julia laid out the full situation for Frank in terms he could understand. She watched his face move through confusion, and then anger, and then something more complicated. The expression of a man realizing that the thing that had happened to him was not merely bad luck, but deliberate design. "Samuel Pryor," he said. "Judge Hollis Pryor's brother." "Yes. Hollis Pryor ruled on the Mendenhall property case 2 years ago," Frank said slowly. "Ruled against old Ben Mendenhall. Ben was sure the ruling was wrong, but none of us could figure out how they had managed it." "Beckett's company acquired the Mendenhall land?" Julia asked. "Sold it 2 months after the ruling to a cattle company run out of Denver." Frank set his coffee cup down with a careful precision. "There are 3 other families in this county who lost property to Beckett's company in the past 4 years. Louis leaned forward. "Frank, do those families still have their original land documents, their records?" "Cal Reeves keeps everything. Former county clerk. Keeps it out of habit, out of something between professional pride and general ornery distrust of the world." Frank looked at Louis with a new quality of attention. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking that Julia and I cannot bring this to a federal court with my testimony alone, But if we walk in with 4 families' documentation plus the letters I am carrying plus the ledger records, we are not one man's word against a powerful operation. We are a pattern, and a federal judge can recognize a pattern. Julia was watching Louis as he said this. She was watching the way the planning mind came forward when there was a concrete problem to solve, the stillness replaced by a focused, careful energy, and she felt again that sensation she had been having with increasing frequency, the sensation of a person whose depth she was only beginning to sound. The next 2 days in Cora Bend were the most productive Julia could remember in recent years. Louis worked with Frank while she rode out to the Reeves property and then to the 2 other affected families, the Garcias and the Whitfields, explaining the situation with the quiet, direct efficiency that was her own primary gift. She did not minimize the danger. She did not oversell the certainty of success. She told them the truth. There was a pattern of deliberate fraud that had targeted them specifically. There was evidence in hand, and there was a federal jurisdiction that could address it if they were willing to provide their documentation and, if required, their testimony. The Garcias had lost 40 acres of the best land they owned. Marisol Garcia, who was the family's practical center in the way that strong women often are the practical center of things without receiving the corresponding credit, said yes before Julia had finished the sentence. Cal Reeves, who had never fully accepted the Mendenhall ruling and had kept his own detailed notes on the proceedings, produced a folder of documents that made Julia's breath catch with its thoroughness. The Whitfields took longer, being cautious people with young children and a legitimate fear of what happened to people who publicly challenged powerful interests in the territory. She did not blame them. She waited and she listened, and she made the case honestly. And in the end, Samuel Whitfield looked at his wife and his wife looked back at him, and they reached a wordless agreement that Julia recognized as the specific communication of 2 people who had been through enough together to speak in silence. On the evening of the 2nd day, she and Louis sat together in the back room of Frank's store, organizing the combined documentation into a coherent sequence of evidence. It was careful, methodical work, the kind that requires concentration and steady hands, and they sat close together over the papers, their heads occasionally near enough that she could smell the soap he had used at the pump that morning, clean and simple, and she was aware of him with every part of her attention that was not actively engaged with the task. At some point she looked up and found him watching her instead of the papers. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. Then, after a pause, "Everything." She held his gaze. The lamp between them cast a soft yellow light across the papers and his hands and his face, and she thought about what he had said that first night at the fire, about the absence of any reason to stop, about the quiet that had arrived when he saw her on the ridge. She thought about 8 months of running and what that did to a person, and what it meant that he was here still, building something with her rather than continuing the flight that had been his only occupation. "Louis," she said. "Julia." "When this is over," she said and stopped. "Yes," he said, as though she had finished the sentence. As though he knew what she was going to say and had the same answer regardless of the specific form the question took. She felt her mouth curve. It was not her careful smile, the one she kept for public use, the one that disclosed nothing. It was the other kind, the one she was not entirely in control of. "Let us finish the work first," she said. "Yes," he said again. They rode for Santa Fe the following morning, a party of 2 with a saddlebag full of evidence, and a plan that was either going to work or going to expose them to the full weight of the operation's capacity to harm. The risk was real, and they both knew it. The road to Santa Fe went through country where the bounty hunters who had chased Louis south of the Jornada might still be operating, and Beckett would by now be aware that his notice had not produced the intended effect, which meant he might have taken other measures. Julia had written a letter before leaving Cora Bend, addressed to the Albuquerque District Office of the Federal Land Bureau, summarizing the case and requesting Judge Emmett Voss's attention. She had sent it with Cal Reeves's son, a reliable boy of 18 who knew the roads and was not recognizable as connected to the matter. If the letter arrived before they did, and if Voss was in Albuquerque rather than on circuit, there was a chance the machinery of response would be in motion before they knocked on any doors. The road north was tense. They rode alert, reading the landscape, reading each other's readings of the landscape. On the first afternoon, they crested a ridge and saw two riders on the road below them who had the particular posture of men waiting rather than traveling. Louis read them the same moment she did, and without speaking they peeled west off the road and rode through open country for 2 hours before returning to the main track. That night, camping in a pine grove at the beginning of the higher elevation, she was quiet for a longer time than usual, and he did not push, but eventually she spoke. "I keep thinking about what Frank said," she said. "That Beckett's men have been through Cora Bend. They know I was there. They know we are coming. They know we have the evidence," Louis said. "That changes their calculation. If we are taken before we reach Santa Fe, the documentation disappears. If we arrive and file with a federal officer, it becomes a matter of record and they cannot disappear it. They are in a position where stopping us before Santa Fe is their only move. And if they try to make that move in the next 2 days, then we do not give them a good opportunity." He looked at her steadily. "There is another option. We could split up. One of us rides with decoys, attracts their attention, while the other takes the documents directly to the federal land office." She looked at him. "That is a sensible tactical suggestion," she said. "I do not like it." "Neither do I," he said immediately. Then, after a pause, "I meant to say that from a purely strategic standpoint it makes sense, but I do not like it either." She looked at the fire. She thought about what it would mean to send him away from her side now when they were this close and the danger was this real. She thought about the specific fear, not the general fear of danger, but the particular fear of losing him. She had not expected to have that particular fear. She had not given herself permission to have it, but here it was, undeniable and fully formed. "We stay together," she said. "We stay together," he agreed. They reached Santa Fe on the 3rd day after leaving Cora Bend, riding into the city in the early afternoon when the plaza was full of activity, and the specific anonymity of crowd was available. Santa Fe in 1882 was a city of layered histories and practical energy, the palace of the governors at its center, the streets a mixture of Spanish adobe and newer Anglo-commercial architecture, the population a crossroads of cultures that had been meeting and clashing and accommodating each other for centuries in ways that were never simple and never fully resolved. The Federal Land Office was on a side street south of the plaza, a solid adobe building with a government flag at its door. Julia had been there once before, 2 years prior, on entirely different business, and remembered the clerk who ran the front office as a meticulous man who wore a vest regardless of the heat, and kept his files in a state that suggested either genuine organization or spectacular performance of it. She went in alone. Louis waited down the street, which was the right decision for several practical reasons, and a painful one for reasons neither of them discussed. She presented herself to the clerk, gave her name, stated her business, and asked whether Judge Emmett Voss was in contact with the office. The clerk looked at her with the patient assessment of a man who received many visitors with business of varying degrees of actual urgency. Then he said, "Are you the Julia Alden who sent a letter from Cora Bend 4 days ago?" She felt something loosen in her chest. "I am. Judge Voss is in the city. He received the letter yesterday and asked to be notified if you appeared." The clerk stood. "If you will wait here." She waited. She waited with her hands in her lap and her saddlebag on the floor beside her, and the accumulated weight of 2 weeks of travel and fear and revelation, and the beginning of something she could not yet name pressing against the inside of her ribs. Judge Emmett Voss was a man of 60 or so, compact and gray-haired and precise, with the eyes of someone who had spent decades looking at documents and people with equal scrutiny and had learned to read both. He came through the inner door and looked at her with those eyes and said, "Miss Alden, Your letter was detailed and specific and made several serious allegations. I would like to hear them in person." "Yes," she said. "But first I need to bring in the man whose evidence is central to this case." Voss looked at her. "Is that man Louis Hale?" "Yes." A pause. "The warrant against Louis Hale is issued from Dona Ana County, which is within my circuit jurisdiction. I have been aware of it for several months, and I have had questions about it for nearly as long." He met her eyes. "Bring him in." She walked out to where Louis was waiting down the street. He read her face before she reached him, and she saw his shoulders drop very slightly with something that was, for him, a demonstrative release of tension. "Voss wants to see you," she said. "He says he has had questions about your warrant." Louis held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached across and covered her hand with his. The same gesture she had made that night at the fire returned to her now like something that had traveled a great distance and come home. "Thank you," he said, "for not turning me in and not running." "You are welcome," she said. "Now come inside before I remember how sensible it would have been to do both." He smiled then, fully, for the first time she had seen, and it changed his face entirely. The weight of 8 months of running lifted briefly, and what was underneath it was something open and genuine, and so unexpectedly warm that she had to look away before she said something she was not yet ready to say. Inside, before Judge Voss, Louis laid out his testimony with the same careful, methodical honesty she had come to associate with him. He was not performative. He did not dramatize or editorials. He presented what he had witnessed, what he had documented, what he understood the pattern to mean, and he did so in the precise, factual language of a man who understood that the power of an account lay in its accuracy and not its emotion. Voss listened without interruption. He read the documents carefully, the letters, the ledger page copy, Louis' written account, the materials Julia had gathered from Frank and Cal Reeves and the Garcias and the Whitfields. When he had finished, he sat for a long time with his hands flat on the table, looking at the organized stack of evidence with an expression of someone assembling a structure in their mind. "Miss Alden," he said finally, "Mr. Hale. What you have brought me is significant. I will be direct. The warrant against Mr. Hale has always struck me as procedurally irregular. The manner in which it was filed, the speed of it, the specific jurisdiction it invoked, these were anomalies that I noted and could not easily explain." He looked at Louis. "I am not in a position to simply dismiss a warrant, but I am in a position to refer this matter to the Federal Territorial Marshal's office and to file an injunction against the property actions in Cora Bend pending investigation. And if the investigation confirms what this evidence suggests, the warrant will be formally vacated." Louis was very still. "How long will the investigation take?" "Months, potentially. These things move at their own pace." He paused. "However, I can issue immediately 2 things. A letter of safe conduct allowing you to move freely in the territory without being subject to arrest under the existing warrant while the investigation is active, and a temporary injunction against the Cora Bend property transfer. Beckett's men cannot move Frank Aldis while this matter is before a federal court." Julia exhaled. The sound came out of her differently than she expected, rougher and more ragged. The sound of someone who had been holding something very tightly for a very long time and was only now beginning to release it. Louis looked at her. He looked at her with everything he had been carefully containing, and she looked back at him with everything she had been carefully containing, and it was the judge who looked down at his papers and gave them the polite privacy of his averted attention. "We will need you both available for testimony when the time comes," Voss said to his papers. "I would ask that you remain in the territory and within reachable distance." "We will," Julia said. They walked out of the Federal Land Office into the Santa Fe afternoon, into the sun and the smell of pine smoke, and the sound of the city going about its life, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They stood side by side on the street and looked at the plaza and the mountains beyond it, and the silence was entirely different from any silence they had shared before. It was not the silence of 2 people being careful with each other. It was the silence of two people who had just arrived somewhere. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "It is not over," he said. "The investigation." "No," she agreed, "but we are not running anymore." Something in his expression shifted. He looked at her with the full and unguarded look of a man who has stopped maintaining the distance required by a life in flight, who has let down a wall he has been holding up for so long that its absence changes the fundamental architecture of his face. "Julia," he said. "Louis," she said. And then she closed the distance between them because she was done waiting and he had already stopped running, and there was no reason, there was not a single remaining reason, to hold back from this. He met her halfway. His hands came up to her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the hard landscape they had ridden through, and when he kissed her she felt it in every part of herself, in the place behind her sternum where the knot from Missouri had lived, in her hands and the soles of her feet and the back of her throat. She felt him breathe. She felt him arrive. They stayed in Santa Fe for 5 days while Voss's office completed the initial paperwork and the letter of safe conduct was formally issued. They stayed in separate rooms at a boarding house near the plaza, which was the appropriate arrangement, though the distance between their rooms felt increasingly theoretical. They walked the city together, ate at the same tables, sat in the evenings on the boarding house porch, and talked in the way of two people who have discovered that they can say almost anything to each other and have not yet run out of things to say. He told her about the horse ranch south of Las Cruces, about the owner, a man named Cordero who had been fair and decent and who Louis had liked, and about what it had felt like to ride out one morning doing ordinary work and return to his life, reorganized around a danger he had not sought. She told him about Missouri, about Gerald Marsh, about the specific injury of discovering that someone you had trusted had been showing you a performance rather than a self. She told him about the years after, the years of deliberate self-sufficiency, the careful management of expectation, the way she had become very good at moving through the world alone and had begun, over time, to mistake competence for preference. "You are not a person who was built for aloneness," he said one evening, looking at her across the porch railing. "No," she admitted, "I am a person who became very good at it. There is a difference." "Yes," he looked at the street. "I was not built for it either," he said. "But I was good at it too, for a while." "What changed?" He looked at her. She knew the answer. She had known the answer before she asked the question. She had asked it anyway because she wanted to hear him say it. "You know what changed," he said. "Tell me anyway." He turned fully toward her on the porch, and the lamplight from the window caught the side of his face, and he looked at her with an openness that still surprised her every time she saw it. This man who had been closed for so long and was now open in the specific way of someone who has made a definitive choice. "I saw a woman on a ridge with a rifle and a fire she had built herself, and an absolute refusal to be diminished by a country that had given her every reason to feel small," he said. "And I thought, there it is. That is what I have been looking for without knowing I was looking." She held his gaze and felt the full truth of what was happening between them, its weight and its rightness, the specific texture of something that was not the quick fire of attraction, which had also been present and was also real, but the slower and more durable warmth of genuine recognition. Two people seeing each other. "I am not without difficulty," she said. "I want to be clear about that before you build any architecture on a false foundation." "Julia," he said, "I have been riding with you for 2 weeks. I have seen you angry and exhausted and frightened and methodical and stubborn and funny. I have not been building on a false foundation." "Funny," she said. "When have I been funny?" "The morning you told the magistrate's clerk in Alcalde that you were peripherally connected to your companion's circumstances, with a face like a woman explaining the weather." She laughed. It came out full and real, and she felt it through her whole chest. He was smiling at her, that smile that changed his whole face, and she thought that she would like to see that smile every day. She thought this very clearly and without qualification. "Louis," she said. "Julia, stay," she said. "When this is settled, When Voss's investigation concludes and the warrant is vacated and Frank keeps his store, he looked at her with the quiet intensity that was his primary mode of being in the world. "Where? Cora Bend is not a bad place," she said. "Frank has been trying to expand the store's operation. He needs reliable help. There are ranches in the county that would pay good wages to a man who knows horses. And I have been thinking about the school. The settlement has children and no school, and that is a problem that has a straightforward solution if someone is willing to put in the work." He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was forward-looking and tentative in a hopeful way, the expression of someone looking at a possible future and daring to want it. "You are describing a life," he said. "I am describing a life," she confirmed. He reached across and took her hand. Not tentatively, not with the careful reserve of someone managing his own hope, but simply, completely, with the confidence of a man who has made a decision and is done being careful about it. "I already stopped running," he said. "That part was decided the moment I saw you." The investigation conducted by Judge Voss's office, in coordination with the federal territorial marshal, took 4 months. During those months, Julia and Louis returned to Cora Bend and built the life she had described from the components available, which turned out to be more than she had initially assessed. Frank Aldis, operating under Voss's injunction and therefore secure in his property, offered Louis a partnership in the expanded store operation, which Louis accepted and then reorganized with quiet efficiency into something considerably more profitable than its previous configuration. Julia started the school in the old, unused room at the back of the meeting hall, with 12 children on the first day and 16 by the second week. She taught reading and arithmetic and a version of American history that was more honest about its various injustices than the approved textbooks, which produced one complaint from a cattle rancher, whose son had come home with questions the rancher found inconvenient, and universal appreciation from everyone else. They lived in separate accommodations in those months, which was the appropriate arrangement for the community they were a part of and the respect they had for each other and for convention. But they were together in the ways that mattered. At Frank's store in the mornings, walking the settlement streets in the evenings, at each other's tables for meals, in each other's company with the ease of two people who have stopped needing to negotiate the terms of proximity. The community of Cora Bend, which had the practical wisdom of frontier settlements in assessing who was good for whom, accepted them as a unit from the beginning with the quiet approval of people who had seen enough of the alternative. The news from Voss's investigation came in pieces. First, a federal indictment of Thomas Becket on charges of fraud and corruption. Then, an indictment of Samuel Pryor on related charges of judicial conspiracy. Judge Hollis Pryor was removed from the bench pending his own investigation, which eventually resulted in a formal censure and permanent disbarment. The 3 other families whose land had been taken by Beckett's company received legal assistance in filing recovery claims, and 2 of the 4 ultimately succeeded in recovering their properties, a mixed outcome but one that was more than nothing, which the territory's legal landscape had too often produced. The warrant against Louis Hale was vacated on a Wednesday morning in November, 4 months after their arrival in Santa Fe with the evidence bundle, 4 months after the kiss on the street, outside the federal land office. The letter from Voss arrived with the Morning Post, and Frank was the one who brought it to Louis in the back of the store, where Louis was reviewing inventory. Frank stood there watching while Louis read it, and when Louis looked up, Frank's expression was that of a man who has been holding good news on behalf of someone else and is very glad to hand it off. Louis stood with the letter in his hands for a long time. Then he went to find Julia. She was at the school. He waited in the doorway while she finished the reading lesson, watching her with the children, watching the way she moved between them with attention that was neither condescending nor falsely enthusiastic, but genuine, seeing each one as a specific person with a specific way of engaging with the world. The children liked her with the honest intensity that children reserve for adults who treat them as intelligences worth respecting. When the lesson finished and the children filed out, she looked up and saw him in the doorway, and she read his face the way she had learned to read it over months of careful attention. "It came," she said. "It came." He held the letter out to her. She read it. She read it twice. Then she set it on the desk and looked at him, and the expression on her face was one he would carry with him for the rest of his life, open and full, and without any of the careful management she usually applied to her strongest feelings. He crossed the room in 3 steps and held her face in his hands and kissed her in the school where she taught. In the afternoon light coming through the window, she had cleaned herself the first morning. She put her hands against his chest and kissed him back, and when they broke apart she was laughing softly and he was laughing too, which was something neither of them had done much before they found each other and which both of them were making up for with interest. "Ask me," she said. He knew what she meant. He looked at her with all of himself present in the look, the man who had run for 8 months and stopped, the man who had carried a bundle of evidence and a carefully maintained hope, the man who had found what he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. "Julia Alden," he said, "would you do me the considerable honor of marrying me and making my already improving life something I could not have imagined before you?" "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. You stopped running and I was the reason. I have been committed to this outcome since approximately the 3rd day." He laughed again, and she put her arms around him, and he held her in the school in Cora Bend, New Mexico Territory, in November of 1882, while outside the wind came off the mountains carrying the first real cold of the coming winter, and the settlement went about its afternoon in the ordinary way of a place where something important had just happened quietly. They married in December, in the small church that the settlement's Mexican community had maintained for 30 years, and which was the closest thing Cora Bend had to a formal civic space. The ceremony was conducted by the traveling minister who came through every 6 weeks, a cheerful man named Dunmore who had the practical theology of someone who had performed services in every condition that the frontier could produce, and had concluded that the essentials were few, and the ceremony was primarily for the community's benefit. The community came, all of it. Frank Aldis in his best coat, which had been good once and was good in memory. Cal Reeves with his folder of documents, as though good records might be required at any moment. Marisol Garcia with her family and the specific dignity of a woman who had fought for her land and was still fighting, and had decided to celebrate other people's good things without waiting for all of her own to be resolved. Julia wore a dress she had made in the 2 weeks before the ceremony from fabric Frank had ordered special from Albuquerque, a deep blue that caught the candlelight in the church and made Louis, when he saw her come through the door, go briefly and completely still in the manner that was his most honest response to things that mattered most. He had bought a new coat. He had washed and barbered himself into a version of himself that retained all the essential qualities she loved, but had been given careful attention, and he stood at the front of the church looking at her as she walked up the center aisle looking like a man who could not quite believe his luck and had decided to believe it anyway. She had not expected to cry. She was not generally a person who cried at ceremonies. She cried anyway, a few tears that she did not bother to conceal because there was nothing in them to conceal. They were simply the outward evidence of feelings that were too complete for their container. He caught one with his thumb when she reached him very gently, and she looked up at him and he said quietly just for her, "I am right here. I am not going anywhere." "I know," she said. "That is why I am crying." They exchanged the words of the ceremony in clear, steady voices, meaning each syllable, and when Dunmore pronounced them married, the church made the sound of a small community expressing its genuine happiness for 2 of its own, and Louis kissed her with the same quality she had come to associate with everything he did. Complete attention, absolute honesty, the specific gentleness of a strong person who is very aware of the weight of what they are handling. The life they built in the years after was not free of difficulty because no life is, but it had the quality of a thing constructed on solid ground by two people who understood what they were building and why. The store continued to expand under Louis's management and Frank's cheerful oversight, adding a modest freight operation by 1884 that served 3 surrounding settlements and employed 4 additional men. Julia's school grew from its single room to a 2-room affair by 1885. With a junior teacher, she trained herself from among the settlement's older students, a serious-minded young woman named Clara Reeves, Cal's daughter, who had inherited her father's love of careful records and Julia's own conviction that a mind was a thing worth developing. In the spring of 1884, their first child was born, a boy they named Thomas, not for Thomas Becket, about whom Julia said firmly that she would not honor with any association whatsoever, but for Louis's father's father, a Kansas farmer who had by all accounts been a good and steady man. Thomas Hale arrived in the world at 4 in the morning with the decisive energy that would characterize him for the rest of his life, making his presence known emphatically and without apparent concern for the hour. Louis was present for the birth, which was not universal among men of his time, and which the midwife, a capable woman named Rosa, regarded with the pragmatic approval of someone who has seen many fathers make themselves scarce and considers those who do not to be people of sense. He held Julia's hand through the hard hours, and when the baby came, he held the child for a long time in the particular way of a man who has been surprised by the magnitude of his own feeling. "He looks like you," Julia said from the bed, exhausted and satisfied. "He looks like an opinion," Louis said, and she laughed even though everything hurt because he was right. The child had arrived with an expression of strong views not yet fully articulated. Thomas grew into a boy of good energy and strong will, easier to manage when given genuine reasons for things than when given simple instructions, which Julia had anticipated and Louis had not but adapted to quickly. A second child came in 1886, a girl they named Clara as well, though they called her Clem at home to distinguish her from the teacher, a distinction the teacher Clara Reeves found charming rather than confusing. Clem Hale arrived with the opposite of her brother's emphatic energy, quiet and observant, watching the world from the beginning with large dark eyes that missed nothing, her father's eyes, which would deepen into something very like her father's quality of still intelligence as she grew. Frank Aldis died in 1887 of a heart complaint that had been coming for years, and which he had managed with characteristic stubbornness, refusing to slow down until the body made the decision for him. He died in the store in his chair on the porch, on an October afternoon that was exactly the kind he had liked best, sun and cool air and the mountains clear in the west. He left the store and its operation to Louis and Julia in a will that he had drawn up with a lawyer from Albuquerque 2 years prior, with the comment in the document that they were the closest thing to family he had had since his wife died, and that the store was better in their hands than it had ever been in his, which was true, and which he had said to their faces often enough that it was not a surprise, only a formalization. They held his funeral on the following Sunday, and the whole of Cora Bend attended, and Julia spoke about him with the honesty of someone who had known a person well enough to see both the full measure of him, and what she said made people laugh and cry in the way of a proper goodbye, which was what he deserved. In 1888, a third child came, another boy, born in August in the intense heat of a New Mexico summer, who they named Frank without any ambiguity about the reason. Frank Hale was, from the beginning, a sunny and demonstrative child who loved everyone he encountered, and was loved in return with the easy universality that some people inspire without apparent effort, which seemed to Julia to be exactly what the name required of him, and she said so, and Louis agreed, and little Frank grew up knowing his name was a tribute and conducting himself accordingly. The case that Voss had initiated against Becket concluded in 1886 with convictions on fraud charges and a significant financial judgment against Beckett's land company. Samuel Pryor received a prison sentence. The land company's assets were partially liquidated to compensate its victims. It was not perfect justice, and it was not fast justice, but it was real, which was more than the territory's history of such matters usually produced. Marisol Garcia's family recovered their 40 acres. The Whitfields received a financial settlement that allowed them to expand the farm they had built on different land. Cal Reeves added the court documents to his folder and updated his notes with the outcome in his precise, careful hand. Julia received a letter from Judge Voss when the case concluded, a formal letter on court stationery with a personal postscript in a different pen, smaller and less official, that said, "Your evidence and Mr. Hale's testimony were essential. The territory is better for the work you both did. I hope Cora Bend is treating you well." She read the postscript to Louis over their kitchen table, and he looked at the letter and then at her, and at the two children playing in the yard outside the window, and at the house they had built together around the rhythm of work and meals and evenings, and the accumulating specific knowledge of two people who have chosen each other fully and kept choosing. "The territory is treating us very well," he said. She folded the letter and reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and the kitchen was warm and the children were loud outside, and the mountains were doing what they always did, standing at the edge of everything with their patient, enormous permanence. There was an evening, some years later, when the children were older and the store was established and the school was a fixed and valued institution in Cora Bend, and the warrant was a piece of history so thoroughly resolved, it was almost difficult to remember the weight of it, when they sat together on the porch after the children were in bed. The night was clear, the kind of New Mexico night where the stars feel close enough to be addressed directly, and the air had that particular quality of the high desert after sunset, clean and cool with the memory of heat still in it. Louis was looking at the stars. Julia was looking at him, which was something she still caught herself doing after all the years, reading his face with the same attention she had brought to it at a fire in the desert when his name was on a wanted notice, and she had not yet understood what he was or what he meant, or what the feeling she was carrying toward him would eventually become. He turned and found her looking. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "That first fire," she said. He nodded. He did not need her to specify which fire, which moment. He carried it too. "You told me you stopped running the moment you saw me," she said. "I did," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "Not of you, of the fact that I believed you." "I know," he said. "You could tell. Julia, you believed me and it frightened you and you stayed anyway and set about solving the problem so that you could earn the right to believe me without it being reckless." He looked at her with the full warmth that the years had made more fluent but not less intense. "That is exactly who you are." She looked at him. She thought about the road from that first fire to this porch, about everything the road had contained, the evidence and the rides and the judge and the children and the store and the school and Frank Aldis in his chair, and the years of ordinary, extraordinary life that two people build when they have decided to stay. "Louis," she said. "Julia," he said, "we did all right." He leaned over and kissed her temple, then her cheek, then the corner of her mouth with the easy familiarity of long love, which is not the diminished version of new love but the deeper version, the one that has been tested by time and found to hold. "We did more than all right," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The stars were out in their full number. The mountains were there in the dark, felt more than seen, their presence as constant as anything she had learned to trust. The children were asleep inside, Thomas and Clem and Frank, each one a specific irreplaceable person, each one made from the fact that two people had once sat across a fire from each other and decided, against all the evidence of their respective difficulties, to stay. The desert wind came off the mountains with the smell of pine and sage, and the settlement of Cora Bend was quiet, and Julia Alden Hale sat on her own porch with her husband who had stopped running and never started again, and felt the full weight of what a life could be when it was made of the right things by the right people at the right fire. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the specific and irreducible way of things that are genuinely good, exactly what it was supposed to be.